Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and one of my favorite books of all time is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the original one. There's been so many remakes of it over time, but one of the big questions of that book is what are the boundaries of morality and science? And that's a concept that has been explored in several fictional works, both movies, books, TV shows. And it's a great question. Do we restrain scientific discovery for the sake of morality, or do we give up morality, and is that giving up our humanity in order to pursue and achieve scientific results? Today's episode is going to get into that topic in one degree with a modern example of that, a modern example that most people overlook or unaware about, and that is being misconstrued in ways that you can't even fathom. So we are here with someone who has actually dove into that industry, has lived the results of it, and is going to be talking about that stuff with us here today. Peter J. Boni, so great to have you here. Could you please introduce yourself for us?
Hi, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast. I'm Peter Boni, Peter J. Boni. I always considered myself uh, a product of three experiences. One was an only child in a Italian family, growing up with a sick dad who took his own life when I was 16 years old. So that was impactful for me. The college education I got opened doors of opportunity for me that I never expected in my whole life. And the experiences as a special operations team leader in Vietnam created some collaborative leadership style for me. I always took my DNA for granted, but I learned at age 49 that my dad wasn't biological. He was sterile, and I was a product of a artificial insemination with a anonymous sperm donor in the weaning days of World War II in 1945. So that was a little bit of a shock to the system.
For sure. I didn't even know they were doing it that far back in time. And so before we continue forward with the episode, I'd like to know where you stand on all of this. Are you for it with more restriction, or are you completely against the idea?
Well, I'm all for science to enable wanting people to have a family, just with some consideration for the very people created by the science, people like me, AKA the Frankensteins of the world. All right.
Right.
I've never been called a Frankenstein before. Thanks for that.
Yeah, it was not my intention, but it's along that same lines of, creating life. Humans should be allowed to do that. And we won't get into the whole religious root of that because that's a whole conversation separate from this. This is just, humanity itself. And so you talk about an anonymous donor. Do you believe that donations should not be anonymous at all? Be that way, like, do you think that if someone donates, they should sign paperwork that says, I give my full consent that whoever is made with my donation can reach out to me at a certain point in time?
Well, let's answer that in two different ways. First of all, uh, today's science, DNA over the internet, consumer DNA testing, has taken the whole concept of anonymity and thrown it out the obsolescence heap. So there's no such thing as anonymity anymore. But if you listen to all of the social science researchers, and there are a plethora of them over the last 20 years or so, they all say the same thing, and that is that in the best interest of the person, the child, they should know right up front, right at the very beginning of their life, let that be part of their woodwork, uh, their origin.
So you believe that all parents who artificially create their child should let them know at what age would you say, and that all parents should tell them like, hey, by the way, you were made from a donation, and if you want to know about your real biological parents, we'll give you that information.
And once again, all the social science research agrees that it should be immediate, just part of the talking points of a child. And as a child
Mm.
becomes more mature, then more of those questions can be answered.
Yeah,
But
you've referenced some social science studies. So what kind of was the baseline for that? Just like in terms of psychological development, it was far healthier or far more effective to raise a child with that knowledge up front rather than the
Absolutely.
traumatic shock.
Absolutely far healthier. No trauma involved in it. I mean, I was 49 years old when I learned, and
Yeah,
I'm still the same person, but everything inside of me changed.
right. Can you tell us more about that shock? Because it's like it's kind of like a piece of your identity has just been taken and twisted around. I mean, were you questioning everything else in your life about, what else about your family life had been a lie and all that?
Uh, what I learned is that new trauma, this identity trauma, rekindles old traumas thought long past.
Mm.
So, when I experienced this identity trauma, I rekindled the death of my dad, and that I had never properly grieved for his death to begin with. Old school Italian family, keep it quiet, don't let anyone
Right.
know. I, uh, I felt flawed uh, and vowed to myself as a kid that I would be strong and resourceful and independent and successful and not let this ever bother me. Well, it did bother me, but I just didn't properly deal with it. And it impacted my marriage as well because there was a, uh, a, a veil of secrecy that I kept around that.
Mm.
And my wife felt that some intimacy, she was robbed of some intimacy with me because I couldn't really express my feelings about the death of my dad. So that was uh, number one. Number two was the whole trauma of service in Vietnam. When I returned home, attacked by my local citizens while wearing my full uniform, I learned early on that nobody wanted to know and I wasn't going to tell them. So there was a whole trauma of today it's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Back then they didn't call it anything. Just get over it. You're home.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had all my arms and my legs. My head was unreasonably straight. Uh, but I had some seething anger about that whole experience, and that was difficult to deal with as well. But I just swept it aside. So this third thing, the identity trauma, I didn't know if I had siblings. I was raised as an only child. I didn't understand my medical history. I thought it was one thing and it was another. I didn't know what my genealogy was. So all that was really important to me. So my family and my friendship circle encouraged me to go get some therapy on this. Well, I signed up to the old school of thinking on therapy. If
Mm.
you're needy, maybe you need some therapy, but weak and needy people are unfit for command. I saw that
Yeah.
in the boardroom, and I saw that in the boardroom. I was a CEO of the high technology industry at that time. But I knew I needed some help, so I very quietly sought some therapy. And it took me a while to find the right kind of a therapist that dealt with uh, trauma. And when I found the right guy, he said, "Son, you hit a trifecta here because old trauma rekindles the new trauma thought long past. In order to get you past anything, we have to deal with all of them. So go back to your childhood, go back to your experiences in combat, and then let's deal with this identity thing going on." So that was the toughest turnaround in my life.
Yeah. So you mentioned, wondering about siblings, and as a man who's done a lot of research into this, what did you find in your journey to discover more about your DNA and genetics?
Well, when I learned in 1995, DNA was 12 years away from being invented. Uh, it was first brought up by 23andMe in 2008, and it was Time Magazine's Innovation of the Year in 2008. Uh, in 2008, I signed up to 23andMe, one of their early customers, one of the lunatic fringe, they call it in high technology. And I found that I wasn't Northern Italian. I was English, French, and a sliver of Scandinavian. Well, I could have dealt with that, but I was trying to find a paternal relative and I couldn't find any. And I was fairly new to the database. So I thought, let's let the customer base grow. And then eventually I'll
Right.
find, 9 years later, there still was no paternal relative there. But I learned that ancestry.com had come to the fold in 2012, and over a 5 year period of time had actually increased the customer set larger than 23andMe. And they were doing Black Friday specials for $49. So I signed up to ancestry.com, and it was through that mechanism, some 22 years after I had learned that I was donor conceived, that I found my paternal seed and found a sibling. Now I have a couple of siblings that I know of, that I know personally, and others that I know of that don't have any interest in
So
learning.
for your siblings, did they all know they were made artificially? And if not, did you discuss that with them?
Uh, One was actually the daughter of the donor, the
Mm.
natural daughter of the donor, who had no idea that her father was a sperm donor. And the other one was my age, 5 months younger than myself, who learned that she was donor conceived at her age of 75.
Wow.
Now, I'm not the product of the frozen sperm generation. And we had my parents used an ethical practitioner who wasn't using his own sperm on countless patients. That happens today.
Mm.
It's discovered today. So it's not likely that I'm going to have 100 siblings like many people do.
Oh,
But
okay.
my question is really one that will never be answered. How many siblings do I have really? I'll just never know. Did I ever date a sibling or worse? I just never know.
Right, right. And that's such an interesting concept, and let's get into, you talk about ethics right there. You mentioned that, and you talked about some unethical practices. So what I know is you've really have like dove into the world of this artificial insemination. And so tell us a bit about how that all played a role into the books that you've written.
Sure. Well, when I learned I was donor conceived and there was no records kept and there was no DNA, uh, I did some research using some clues a mother gave me that turned out to be black holes. Uh, so, my only recourse, I seemed to me, was to learn about the entire industry that enabled my creation. So
Hmm.
I started doing a research study, almost like a PhD student, of the sociological, scientific, and legal history and the evolution of assisted reproductive technology, actually from biblical references right through to today. And as I got into this, I found that, we have regulatory oversight for a variety of industries, the SEC, the FDA, the ITC,
Right, right.
and so on down the line, all are providing some regulatory oversight to industries for the public good, because industries don't tend to police themselves all that well. Now,
Right. We
here
know
we
about that.
here we have an industry that is self-policed, that's creating human life uh, with no genetic testing required, with no health care history required, with no legal consequences for blatant fertility fraud, with no requirement for a sibling registry, so people know of one another, with no cap really to the number of siblings or the number of offspring per donor. Hence, people have over 100. Can you imagine having over 100 siblings that you don't know?
I barely like the two that I have already. So
And
uh,
no counseling requirement for either a donor or a recipient,
mm,
the needs of the donor conceived child. So like I said, when I began learning about the practices of the industry, which is now a multi-billion-dollar industry growing exponentially, I had a friend that was breeding Rottweilers at the time, and he said, there's more regulatory oversight to breeding puppies. And I find that's true for the canine, bovine, equine, and so on down the line. There's a lot of regulatory oversight.
yeah. No, that's Do you think that the breeding of animals is treated with more regulation than the breeding of humans? And let me ask you this, because I've never been involved with, donating or artificial creation. There is the paperwork done where there's no legal ties. So let's say I donated, and then further down the line, there's an offspring made with my seed. Can they just show up in my life and ask for money or anything legally, or that is at least taken care of?
Well, that is at least taken care of, and that's the good news for any donor. There's no legal requirement uh, to an offspring.
Okay, because I was just thinking, you mentioned, let's say, for example, 100 siblings. What if I had 100 kids just show up, all half my genetics, and say, we need child support? Definitely don't want to be wrapped up in that. So I was wondering how that works. And
You weren't conceived through the backseat of a car.
right, right. So as far as so what would you like to see change? Like, I know your book is like one of those ways that you're trying to make an impact into the industry, but what really needs to happen ultimately? Do we need a Congress member to kind of like step up and say something about this? Does it need to be at the level of presidency? Is there a lower level that we can handle this kind of situation?
What I advocate for is the donor conceived Bill of Rights, which uh, eliminates anonymity and requires open donation, number one, that
Hmm.
requires genetic testing and health history release, that requires a limit to the number of offspring per donor, that requires a sibling registry, that requires some mandated counseling for donors and recipients regarding the needs of a donor conceived child, and requires some legal consequences for blatant fertility fraud. Now, that's being advocated for at both the federal and the state level.
Okay.
There are now 13 states that have legislation for fertility fraud penalties. Uh, the state of Colorado is the first one to have enacted this donor conceived Bill of Rights. It's being considered in several other states. But I think it'll take a congressperson that realizes that they are donor conceived to be a champion inside of
Hmm. Yeah.
in order to get this through the dysfunctional U.S. Congress.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. You need someone who actually has a heart and a foot in that battle. And so when you talk about fertility fraud, for those of us who aren't, familiar or involved with artificial insemination, what is fertility fraud?
Well, at the highest level, it could be a doctor that used his own sperm as opposed to an anonymous donation from a third party
Hmm.
to inseminate his patient. And he did this several times, maybe 100 times. All right. So that's one example of fertility fraud. Another one is an individual that goes to a sperm bank to sell his sperm. He claims that he's a PhD and speaks 6 languages, and really he's a schizophrenic and a convicted felon.
Hmm.
Real live examples. So people that lie about their background at a sperm bank, for instance,
Do they
all
not do background checks or like, because I'm not familiar with that at all. You don't have to like, they don't genetically test you first or do a health and wellness check or anything.
there's no legal requirement for them to do so. Now,
Wow.
whether they do it is up to them, but there's no legal requirement for that.
That is truly, truly insane because then you could be putting bad genetics out there. You could be putting extra aggressive genetics or health issues out there.
And
So this really is a shock to me that it's not regulated on a
it gets,
legal level.
it gets worse. Can you imagine finding what kind of quality control would you find when you get a sperm donor through something like Craigslist or on social media? There are
Right.
social sites now that are bypassing anything that a bank might do.
Mm. Wow. I can't believe that. I've never really looked into it, but I would have expected, I'm sure most of us, I think this is one of the issues is that most people just assume that they're doing, because unless we don't donate ourselves, we just assume they're doing background checks, they're doing medical background checks and all this and that. And here you are telling us that they're not.
There's no legal requirement for them to do so.
Right.
One may do it, the other one may not, but there's no legal requirement for anybody to do so. For organ donation, there's regulatory oversight. For blood donation, there's regulatory oversight. How about gametes, the seeds of human life? There are no regulatory
That's
agencies looking at this.
wow. That I can't believe that. And so tell us more about your book. I know you wrote a whole book kind of exposing the industry. If you could share the name of that with us and kind of why you wrote it.
Where my book, Uprooted Family Trauma, Unknown Origins, and the Secretive History of Artificial Insemination, can be found on my website, www.peterjboni.com. I got the idea for the book upon doing this research on the industry and its practices and speaking to my friend who told me about puppies, breeding puppies. And I thought, boy, this could be a thought-provoking book. But in order to write it, I had to finish my own story.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 2017 through ancestry.com that I was able to finish my story, understand my genetic origins, my health history, and uh, actually meet some siblings. So on that note, I decided to write this book as both a very deeply intimate memoir as well as a tell-all expose about the practices of a multi-billion dollar and growing industry that's underregulated.
Mm.
And I had three goals, like I mentioned. Goal number one, to impact the legislative agenda towards the donor conceived Bill of Rights, to influence industry practices positively, and then to speak to the needs and emotional well-being of many people that are misattributed. What I learned in my research is that some 4% of the population, it's in the Western Hemisphere, it's uh, predicted to be that people are misattributed. Their DNA and their birth certificate just don't line up.
Wow.
Now, 4% would be in my high school graduating class, which was 100 kids. Four of us would be misattributable. I know I'm one of them. I had two of them come to me to say, Pete, we're not figuring out our DNA from our ancestry or 23andMe results. You seem to have some expertise in this. Can you help us out? And I walked them through the fact that they were misattributed for specific reasons. And then we know of a fourth. So in my high school graduating class of 100, there's already
Wow.
four. That kind of corroborates that. Pew Research has taken a look at this as well, and they've corroborated that they believe about 5% of the current 50 million customer base of DNA uh, customers have learned that their DNA and their birth certificate just don't line up.
Wow.
From a parent standpoint, it's called NPE, and you have a non-parental relationship, non-parental expectation.
Mm. Okay.
Oh, it's bigger than that when you consider you have how many parents? How many parents do you have?
Most people have two, right?
Grandparents biologically, you have,
Or
and then great
it could
grandparents.
just
It
go, it
becomes
grows and grows, grows. Yeah.
metric in proportion. So if I did this geometrics and use that 4% number, my entire high school graduating class of 100 is misattributed to somebody in their family tree between their third to sixth great grandparent. Think about that. So all
Wow.
those stories about family lore, the Mayflower or what have you, might be
Right.
true. 4% chance that it's not.
Mm.
Something was askew.
That's definitely interesting theory to think about. And like you said, being proven, and every day there's more and more people doing these DNA tests and figuring out. So who knows, that number may continue to grow over the next few years. Well, I have to ask you that I'm sure everyone listening is also curious is, Mr. Boni, are you yourself a donor?
No, I'm not.
Has the thought ever crossed your mind, or because of all your research, you were like, I'm never doing this?
I never fathomed in a million years that I would have done that. I didn't even know about donor conception up until I started researching this myself. In college, I never knew of donor conception. Uh, I was never asked in college about being a donor, so it was just totally out to lunch for me. Now,
Right.
I was a poor kid college student, so the chance of making another $100, I might have considered it, but I never was given that opportunity.
Okay, yeah, I was just interested because
Being 20-year-old kid is not going to think about the ramifications on another human being.
yeah, for sure. No, talking with you today, I was thinking about, I've never thought about it. I'm like, would I want to do that? And with what you've said about the industry right now, I've got mixed opinions. So we'll see. Like you said, it's the providing that opportunity for people who can't have children to have it is a beautiful thing. And I do want to go back to you. You mentioned your research took you back to biblical references. Were you saying biblical references about artificial insemination or that concept? Can you kind of go into that information for us?
Biblical references of NPE, you're non-parental, you have a genetic surprise.
Mm.
Moses was an NPE. He had a genetic surprise. He was closed adopted. He never knew that.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great example. Yeah.
Pew
So,
Research has discovered that almost 1 in 5 of the 50 million people in the database, their prediction is have had some sort of a genetic surprise, if not from their parents, that's 4%, 5%, then certainly within their family tree. They have found a sibling they didn't know, a relative that they didn't know, or uh, a grandparent that they didn't know, and so on.
yeah, I've never done genetic testing and I'm not really interested in it at all, but I do know that my mom's father was adopted. And so where his family tree traces back biologically and genetically, Um, we've never known. Now, with all the DNA testing stuff, who knows? Maybe he could figure it out. But he's also in his late 70s and doesn't care, about that. He spent his whole life being raised by who he was raised by. Those are his parents. So I get that. And me personally, I've never been curious, but I know there's a lot of people out there with the genetic testing trying to find out the truth. And today's conversation has definitely piqued my curiosity as far as is everything in my family tree align with what I've always been told. It's definitely an interesting idea that I think a lot of people have. And so, will you be writing any more books in regard to artificial insemination or family trees at all?
Well, we'll see. We'll see about that. Right now, my book is just this is my second book. It's a few years old, and I'm busy using that as a vehicle to advocate for the donor conceived Bill of Rights.
Right. And so, you've
You know,
talked.
you mentioned something that genealogical bewilderment is a term that I learned in psychology class in
Mm,
the 60s. A pair of psychologists coined the term when they were studying some difficulty in relationships that adoptees had. All right.
mm. Yeah, yeah.
Genealogical bewilderment was something raging inside of them. And I wasn't adopted, I was semi-adopted in this thing called donor conception. And that feeling of genealogical bewilderment just raged inside of me and put high octane fuel in my need to research my background. What were my genetics? What was my health history? Did I have any siblings? I was just enraged to find that. It just burned a hole in me until I finally got my answers.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking about with when you talk about telling children up front if they were created artificially, I did wonder how that would impact their relationship with their, current family, if they would bond with them as closely as if they had not known, and would they have that curiosity, always thinking about what if they were with whoever, had donated them, how that affected the child growing up.
And let me give you an example, my personal example. When I learned my heritage, and I wasn't Northern Italian, I didn't know what I was. I wanted to. I said to myself, "No more secrets." All right, this is just. I'm not going to sign into this.
Right.
So my Italian cousins aside, and I let my Italian cousins know that we're not biological. And they coined me the logical Italian, and I was now their logical cousin because I wasn't biological. So that sets up something about family.
Yeah.
We had common foods, common traditions, common values. We had common enemies like the adults when we misbehaved as kids.
Right.
And I found that my coming to them and letting them know my parents' secret created a bond of intimacy that we never had before. And if anything, we are closer now as
Mm.
logical than we were as biological cousins. So it reestablished for me a parameter of family. Family isn't just biological.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And as we close off here, you mentioned your website and your book earlier. I mean, who should read it? I know for one thing it's to spread awareness and advocacy, but I mean, would you say it's just an interesting and curious read in general for people who are interested in a variety of different topics?
You've got if if 25% of the DNA community is misattributed for whatever the reason, uh, not from their parents, but from their great parents or what have you. Uh, you've got a lot of people there. Maybe you're one of them, or maybe you know someone, and being in touch with some of their emotions is an important factor to support them. If you have any kind of an interest in industry reading itself, or the history, sociological, legal, and scientific history, it's interesting reading. Some of the geneticists, the genetic institutions, the heritage foundations, all been recent readers of my book as well. Genealogical societies as examples.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think it's interesting, this whole concept of legal regulation and lack thereof in terms of human creation. And, I'll be keeping my eye on the news to see if they put out a Peter J. Boni clause, if they name it after you, that would be pretty cool. Uh, if they make like the documentations requiring companies of artificial insemination to have mandatory background checks and all that. Hopefully they name it after you since
Well,
you are the one out here doing all the work. That would be pretty awesome to see.
I had a friend that had a bridge named after him. That was after he died. I'm not interested in having anything named after me.
Yeah,
I'd rather just live my life and know that I'm making an impact.
for sure. And so ladies and gentlemen, I encourage y'all to help Mr. Boni make an impact by sharing this episode with just with anyone, honestly, because it's such a interesting part of our society, of the world that we're living in that we just don't know about. I mean, it's happening. Like you use the word secretive. I mean, it almost is. It's almost like right under our noses. It's happening and we just don't know it because so many people aren't looking into it. Unless you're donating, you're not looking into it. And then, of course, when you want to donate and they're like, yeah, come on in, just give us a sample, it's like you're happy because it's so easy.
Well,
But this
sociology,
cover,
sociology has certainly changed from the waning days of World War II when I was conceived.
right.
We're more open about this issue of infertility. It has less of a social stigma. Uh,
Mm,
Infertility has grown some 50% in the last 4 decades. It has been studied. Combination of a toxic environment
yeah.
and just waiting longer, so the biological clock is not working to their advantage. And medical science has claimed that some 15% of couples have fertility issues for whatever the reason. Half of them because of the man, half of them because of the woman, some 20% of them a combination. And
Wow.
IVF as an industry has actually exploded as a result of that. So,
Yeah, and so as this industry grows, we need to keep an eye on it and help regulate it and make sure that it's regulated so that situations like what happened to you, like what happens to, like you mentioned, 4 or 5% of the population doesn't continue to happen. And so that number doesn't continue to grow, and that hopefully everyone can be born into this world knowing who they are, genetically and biologically and where they come from.
absolutely.
Yeah, so Mr. Peter J. Boni, thank you so much for doing what you do with your book as well as podcast guesting to spread information and awareness and hopefully create that change so that the future generations can have those lives of peace in terms of their history.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to present my book.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide, through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side, as one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.